to be taken to task over one thing. They said there's no broad-based opposition. It's a huge problem. I don't think that that concept of having a broad-based opposition that will transition Uganda into civilian rule is there. And I think Mr. Museveni is going to be here for a while longer. And if he continues with this grooming of his own son to transition him into power, it will be the first time that in East Africa that a sitting president has put his son into power. And that will send a terrible message to this region. You know, our main ambition, Zainab, in this region is to have a borderless East Africa with one currency, with zero tariffs, where we can all trade and increase the gross national product, the gross domestic product of this region by 100 times. That needs democratic government. It does not need despotism. It doesn't need absolutism. It needs a system of civilian government that can guarantee that trade and prosperity becomes part and parcel of this region, because we're a rich region. We have resources, we have all the people, we have a lot of people who are trained in all the professions, but the state in all our regions are an impediment to development instead of being a helper in the process of developing this region.
Right, but a lot of reactions coming from most of our viewers on social media, what they're saying is there is a huge population of the young people in Uganda, literally, and I know we've spoken a little bit about that, but Dr. Kanenje, they're saying, where does this leave us? We are young and we want change. Where does this leave us?
Very important question.
That is a very, as my colleague is saying, it's a very important question. You know, the challenge that has happened in the continent in the last 10, 30 or 20 or 30 years is a massive increase in young populations. And the increase of population is supposed to be something positive, because you're going to get more people to work. Unfortunately, the opportunities and the economies have not been growing at the same pace as the population. And so, of course, that leaves them on the margins of the economy and the margins of society. Now, we know that it is easy, especially when you're dealing with the youth, to promise them heaven tomorrow. It does not work like that. Even the process of economic growth or opportunities for employment takes time. And so what the youth needs, because they are the determinant of mostly who's going to be the leader in the various countries, is to organize themselves and vote for leaders with a vision. What has been happening, and Kenya is also a test example, you can see the kind of youthful people we elected and how well are we doing in that front again? Exactly, that's the answer. And so it is not about electing a young leader. It's about electing someone with a new vision, with some new ideas, who can be able to mobilize the nation, inspire it, but who actually has a practical agenda for economic growth and social development. And that is one thing that has been lacking, especially in people who are very popular like Bobby Wine, as opposed to someone who is very old, may not have very new ideas, but can provide a level of stability and predictability, because the world knows him, the old people know him, and people in the rural areas, they keep being reminded of the Uganda of yesteryears, and no one likes that.
So let's just suppose, for instance, by a long shot, that Bobby Wine is declared the winner in this election, right? And, you know, we talk about him having zero experience in terms of administration and politics. How then do we see Uganda in terms of lifting the residents from this current depth of despair to the social economic prosperity that they aspire to achieve? Because then 4 more years? First of all, there is there's no lifeline for this presidency. We don't know when it will end. It's going to be as long as it can. There's no strong opposition. We do not know when a strong opposition will come up about. And then you have these young people who are hoping for, some change, something different. So yes, Hashi.
Well, Zainab, that's a very important question. It brings about the whole idea of a post-colonial state,
right,
and what its responsibilities, what is its future? How does it deal with issues of development in society? There are huge questions that we've been grappling with for a long time.
Right.
I suggest to you that there is an answer to this, and that answer is called East Africa. It's a common home of about 5-6 states on the eastern seaboard of Africa, with about 250 million people, about 200 million. And that is a massive wellspring of economic activity. The micro states that we have today are meaningless real estate because their gross national product cannot satisfy, as far as jobs are concerned, the population that Dr. Kananje was talking about, which is between the ages of 17, 18 to 25.
Right.
This is not only is it a security problem, it's an existential question. Because if that force becomes reactionary and becomes violent and it just destroys, things like fascism could crop out of it. Thuggish elements could take state power. And that would cause a serious setback to the kind of progress that we want in state and society in this region. So the problem we have is that the leaders that we have recognize all these issues. They know about them. But it's very difficult for them to make bold, decisive decisions because those types of leaders have not yet emerged out of East Africa. And I suggest to you, Zainab, that if we bring down these borders, if we have the same currency, if we have zero protection policies, if we bring East Africans together, East Africans will create jobs for themselves. They will buy and sell. They'll create industry. They will use all kinds of their intelligence to try and make a living out of their country and out of their region.
Have we reached that level of...
The level is that the political leadership to bring that about is not there. Yoweri Museveni Kaguta, where Yoweri Museveni always talking about East Africa, but he never does anything about it. He's only concentrates on keeping power in Uganda. Keeping power is not equivalent to bringing development. A dictatorship does not bring development. It brings development that sooner or later gets into a question mark, because once you produce a middle class, once you produce an educated society, the first thing they're going to do is question your dictatorship. So it has an end. And I really believe that it's critical for the heads of state and government in this region, through the East African community, they need to come up with very bold decisions on how to bring us together so that we can produce an economy that can produce jobs. When people have jobs, they have hope.
Do you think that maybe Uganda might head the Zimbabwe way?
We cannot rule it out. And the only way to avoid the Arab Spring is to make sure that there are no signs or at least incentives for people to go down that route. Now, Uganda is a very beautiful country. I think one of the most fertile countries I've ever driven through. It is super green. In fact, I'm afraid for our farmers because of the potential that Uganda actually holds. If the new leadership comes to power, whether it's going to be Bobi Wine or still President Museveni, if they want to avoid a potential catastrophe from the youth bulge, one sector that has to be revived and grown, of course, is agriculture. That is where majority population live. Try to build some industry that can be able to get these young people busy at the same time. We have focused generally on very few things, or sometimes cash cropping, in ways that can actually not sustain our economies. We still have not liberated ourselves from the colonial economy that was meant to benefit largely, white folks and settlers. It was not meant to benefit us and the elite. We need to move away from that. And we should not be lied to just saying, well, because the digital world, and therefore if we move into just information age and all of us are going to go to the city. No, we still need to do farming. We still need to construct our roads. We still need to build schools and bridges. Those are things that are going to create jobs, and invest in alternatives that can be able to move our economies forward. And so a number of these things have been neglected, and we're still using economic growth model of the 1960s in 2021. That is just not sustainable and cannot work.
Let's just talk a little bit about the issue of human rights violation in Uganda. There has been, arbitrary arrests, intimidation. You've seen Bobby Wine being blocked, arrested while trying to campaign. And one thing that some of the analysts from the region are talking about is the fact that Yoweri Museveni is using the COVID-19 pandemic to hold on and even tighten his grip on power. Then what does this portend for the other leaders who probably crop up in the future, hoping to change this narrative?
Well, Zainab, the political struggle in Africa is ongoing.
Right.
And it does not run particularly on straight lines. And this is a case of it not running on straight lines. And I think what Dr. Kanenja has spoken about is quite important.
Right.
The structure of the economy that we have
creates
these conditions that we have. And the political culture of violence added upon a uneven economy creates this kind of political culture of force. There is a political discourse now in Africa that is trying to come back. And that discourse is that we cannot do development without dictatorship. That unless we have a Paul Kagame of Rwanda, we're not going to make these steps because the opposition and this parliament are European concepts that are un-African, and therefore we need the super chief to issue instructions and voila, we will get development. I think that is a very naive reading of the script. It is a script of authoritarianism. And of course, I'm very proud of my cousin over there in Rwanda, Mr. Paul Kagame, for all the work that he's done. There's no question about it. Probably the best president we have in the continent today. Because really, he is thumbing his nose to men like me and Dr. Kanenja and saying, you're wrong. We can do this development, and we can have this kind of authoritarianism, and we can have, at the end of the day, all the good things that we're trying to find. But of course, he's educating all the Rwandese in secondary schools and in primary schools and in university. And that's where the opposition is going to come from sooner or later. But that's to anticipate. The point here is, in Uganda, the system of opposition is quite advanced. Ugandans are probably more political than Kenyans. The Ugandan citizen is very aware of the politics of Uganda. And Mr. Museveni doesn't have a central province or Nyanza or Rift Valley that he relies on, like many of our politicians here. He comes from a very small ethnic group. We're relatives, Nyankoles and the Himas. My forefathers went there and got intermarried, and they had this group of people. And this concept of minority and majority in Uganda clandestinely put them together so they could seek power, because power was either in the north or with the Baganda. So I think that Mr. Museveni has built a coalition inside Uganda that I bet you if this election was free and fair, I think that even if he didn't do this violence and he didn't do all this suppression, I think Mr. Museveni would still win this vote, in my view.
Right.
And I'm being quite honest about it. Why he chooses to do this really escapes my my sense and sensibilities, because is it the nature of authoritarianism and the state in Uganda that automatically reacts like this? I want to call on President Yoweri Museveni not to attack the security forces, not to attack that woman who's married to Mr. Bobby Wine, and the son who was crying there when the clothes were being torn off. This is an African. We also have our African culture. It's not acceptable for women to be stripped naked by police security officers. This is so bad. And Mr. Museveni has to stop this kind of edgy, grungy violence that scares the bejeepers out of Uganda.
But you have leaders, African leaders who transition out of power. One of the issues, even our president, one of the key issues that they speak about is leaving some sort of legacy, leaving a good legacy, a good image. do you feel that by the time Museveni is transitioning from power, he's still going to hold, that image that he once held, well, the people of Uganda voted him in, and when he took power actually by force during the guerrilla warfare back then in 1986, that legacy?
1986, loyalty came from the perception that he was a savior. Today, loyalty comes from the perception that he's allowed. That is different. Now, we do not expect that he's going to cut the same image years, down the line. However, one thing that Uganda opposition needs to understand, especially when you're dealing with power, is power is never given; it is taken. It is seized, not by force. But when you're dealing with a system that has been in power for a very long time, you need to be able to communicate or create a framework that can guarantee that those people are not going to be executed. They're going to be safe if they leave power. It is what has helped South Africa transition from apartheid. Pretty much the white power had to negotiate its way out of power. And frankly speaking, if you look in this country, the IPPG in 1997, they were very critical in reducing some pressure caused from the then
member of parliament from Wales,
government. That, well, if you get out of power, you're not going to be prosecuted. You're not going to be victimized. But if you are communicating to somebody a lot of hostility and you're waiting for the day they leave office so you can revenge, what are the chances they're actually going to leave power? And so there has to be a recognition and understanding among the Ugandan civil society and the opposition that we need to get a framework that can actually give President Museveni a safe landing, for instance, and people around him. So we do not have to deal with the fear, because the fear of the unknown, people have seen what has happened. Museveni has seen what happened to Mugabe. Museveni has seen what happened to Gaddafi. Has seen what happened to some of these leaders, even Omar Hassan al-Bashir, we see right now. And so it does not inspire a sense of compromise and reconciliation for someone to be in a position where they are actually willing, perhaps, to allow you more space to campaign and even win power. If by you winning power is going to mean the end of them and wherever else they've been able to create a bill. So it's a reality. We have to move from beautiful rhetoric to practical political reality for countries. And that's the reality.
Right. Hashi, just going back to another issue that a lot of people are also speaking about, is a relationship that the United States has enjoyed with Uganda, or that Uganda has enjoyed with the United States. And look, it did cancel its observation mission in Uganda. And the other key issue that the US said was today's vote, and this was their statement, would lack accountability and transparency. And remember, like you said, they're quite a huge partner with the Western nation, especially national security interest. What does this portend between the relationship for the two countries?
Well, that's an excellent question. I just said just now that the Americans privilege security over the values issue, human rights, democratic government, and all these things. They might say it. They might issue a press conference. They might condemn what's going on. They might do that or this. But at the end, the balance of the security questions in the eastern seaboard of Africa is the United States military command here in Africa. I think it's called AFRICOM. They're here in Kenya as well, is to make sure that the threats that may come from certain areas of the world to the United States are confronted. And when the issues of values or security is brought to the table, more times than not, the issue of security always trumps the issue of value. And I think that it's very high time that we took responsibility for these issues of security, took responsibility for issues around values, and a new charter and a new way of doing politics and the economy in this region is needed. Because what we are doing now is not sustainable. You saw President Kenyatta the other day speak about two tribes not manipulating power in Kenya. In Uganda, they have one tribe manipulating tribal. So, we are advanced tribally than the Ugandans. Of course, the Tanzanians are doing much better than us. The presidents, they do not come from tribes, they come from the party. Even though we know there's trouble with Magafuli. The answer to all of this, I submit to you humbly, is the undiscovered country. And that undiscovered country is East Africa. And I keep saying it, that we have to open these borders, we have to have one currency, and we've got to bring this political economy of this region together. And that leadership has to emerge out of the youth. It has to emerge out of the middle classes. It has to emerge from the elite. A new political vision that is based on making sure that the citizens of this region have access to clean water, have access to jobs, have access to schools, have access to the basic fundamental things that make nations work. Otherwise, if we continue on this path, we're going to be somewhere in between state failure and substandardism. And we then will have a majority of people, about 80% living on $1 a day, and the corrupt few who have stashed billions of dollars out in foreign accounts. And all this, Zainab, does not happen without the cooperation of the Europeans and the Americans. It is not something that is done only internally. And I think the Europeans and the Americans need to start changing their views about how to help this continent. NGOs are not going to help us. It's not NGOs who are going to develop this region. It's not foreign aid that's going to develop this region. It is the power of the people's potential that are going to change this region to make it what it deserves to be. A strong, united region that produces jobs for its unemployed youth. And we need to move forward in this region. Otherwise, we're going to face state failure and state collapse.
But you actually accept the fact that the relationship between the US and our nations is quite critical, right?
Yes, it is very critical.
Dr. Kanenje, on that front, you have Museveni, I think the other day in a televised press conference saying, look, we don't want interference from anybody. We do not care what your views are. This is our election. Please stay away.
Yes, I won't be surprised. And I think right now, any village tyrant is going to be very encouraged by what happened in Washington, D.C.
Very true.
20,000 National Guard police have been deployed to protect the capital from their commander-in-chief, who is Donald Trump. You know, how ironic is that? Now, that aside, U.S. relationship with African countries, and especially East Africa, is critical. For Kenya is an anchor state in this region. Museveni, and as my colleague has alluded to it, at the end of the day, one thing that defines U.S. national interest is security. It's the reason they were able to entertain Marcos in Philippines, Pinochet in Chile,
Right.
and Mobutu in Zaire, or what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, having said that, we also know that the United States has been the leader in world democracy, or at least advocating for that, and in terms of funding and support. But the way the environment is right now, for instance, even in Uganda itself, supporting a democratic process in an environment that is so uncertain, in where the opposition is not clearly defined, it is kind of a losing proposal. Now, I do not agree with these countries boycotting election observation altogether, because that's going to guarantee that bad things happen. At the beginning, you mentioned about human rights violation.
Right.
I don't even know whether we should be talking about human rights violation or how many human wrongs have been committed, thus far. There are plenty. And so staying away because you're protesting being denied access to certain places, you're going to guarantee that you'll never be able to establish with credibility. What we do, especially international diplomacy, is sometimes you have to co-opt these people to be able to influence them. But if you don't, you're going to guarantee they're going to behave badly. Even sanctions have never been demonstrated to actually change behavior of governments around the world. If they did, then the world would be a very peaceful place. And so the US involvement is still critical. And hopefully, with the new administration in Washington, D.C., perhaps the U.S. can return to its place as call it the last, good or rather that city on the hill, the shining city on the hill, that all of us can be able to look up to. That in times of crisis and when our democracy is falling by the wayside, that perhaps we'll be able to get support. But right now, to be honest, the last country with a moral ground to be able to talk about democratic things is the United States. And so I will not be surprised that if anyone at this stage is going to dismiss whatever comes from Washington. But it's still unfortunate that not just Washington, but some European countries have decided not to actually observe that election, because while the fear of legitimizing it is founded, not observing ensures that you will never be able to establish the extent of violations or flawlessness that took place during the election process.
In the elections. Peter here, Kay, says, let me get this very interesting comment here on Twitter. They're saying the United States is in fact complicit in the anti-democratic tendencies of their staunch military ally.
Yes, I agree with him completely, or her. I think that the Americans would really cry foul about this, but I think we're in agreement that the United States have been very involved with Mr. Museveni. And part of the deal has been about him staying in power and not have international criticism about his rule. Mr. Museveni is bold enough to go to CNN. He was with Christian Mumpo.
Right.
And when he was asked whether he would leave if he lost the election, he said with a straight face that I would leave. But he knows that he's not leaving, and he knows that he's going to win power, whether by force of arms or by a proper election. Right. Mr. Museveni is here to stay. It will take an enormous amount of courage and discipline among the Ugandan population to say no. Something close to what happened in Egypt. The problem with that is that the Egyptians are tribalist people. They're one tribe, they're one Arabs. Here in our country and in Uganda and in Tanzania, in Uganda and Kenya and in Uganda, the political elite have exploited the issue of tribalism. So the great philosopher Frantz Fanon said that the stupidity of our times is these tribal chieftains, and he was straight on the money. And it has come to pass that, and we're not even ashamed about speaking about it. We're not ashamed to speak about this anymore. Of course, here in Kenya, we've made it a very beautiful narrative. You could see some of the leaders in this country speak their ethnic languages when they go to these rallies. You know, Jomo Kenyatta, Daniel Torotich Arap Moi, and Mwai Kibaki never made that mistake because they came from a nationalist scenario. No matter what their problems were, this crude kind of tribalism, they didn't have this problem. And even Mr. Museveni, even though he's got a lot of his cronies around him, his narrative is always about getting Pan-Africanism. His narrative is about Ugandan nationalism. His narrative is about bringing people together. But he does precisely the opposite because he does not allow dissent. And once you don't allow dissent in your country, the very idea of that nation state and its developmental path is under a huge question mark. So we have huge issues, but I also am a man of hope because Uganda was in a very bad place before Museveni came. Right. As, we don't want to be always critical of this man because the facts on the ground are there. He stabilized this country. He has done a lot for Uganda, but he needs to understand that it's time for him to go. And there should be a new slogan in Uganda, and it should go like this: "Go, man, go."
Well, that's from Ahmed Hashi there. Look, so look, 35 years ago, he said, like we talked about, he said, I just serve for a certain amount of time and then I'm done. African leaders should not hold on to power. But then again, generally from an African perspective, this is it's quite a common phenomenon that we've seen from African nations. So, Dr. Kanenje, can you, from an African perspective, can you say that this is an ailing part of what is hurting our nation from reaching the level of democracy that we want as a continent, or we hope to?
35 years ago, there was no internet. And there are many things which were not there.
So everything has changed at this point.
Yes, and so people say a wise man or woman changes their mind. So I guess these leaders change their mind after a while. Now they say power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right.
When you're still being driven by idealism, you tend to promise a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
You can promise the moon, you can even promise Mars. When you're confronted by reality, it becomes very different.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when it comes to political power, it is a little bit too sweet, and a lot of people world over do not want to leave political power, including Donald J. Trump. He does not want to leave political power. Yes, but the challenge for us, especially on the continent, is while in the 90s we seem to embrace this new phenomenon, this juicy thing that seemed to change countries. The whole of Eastern Europe had transformed. The Soviet Union collapsed. We saw a wind of change and democratization taking root across Latin America and Africa. And all of us were inspired gradually as the new leaders or the old leaders who allowed a degree of political space consolidated their power. It became increasingly difficult for them to leave power.
Right.
Now, this was not helped by what I would say the relative decline of the West, especially in advancing some of these values. The United States and, of course, Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, the emergency of countries such as China that could provide an alternative in terms of a paycheck, for instance, has made some of these countries actually reluctant to be able to engage or at least try to implement those sometimes harsh, structural adjustment programs, liberalization, and stuff like that. And so African countries increasingly having alternatives where to go to. But generally, in the last 10 years, there's also been an increasing shift towards populist right-wing parties in the West. Now, that does not help our own democratic experiments on the continent. Because if where democracy is supposed to be emulated is on the decline, then who are we to think we can, or at least I'm just trying to phrase devil's advocate, that we can actually be able to take it forward?
Right.
And so, and the people on the continent also became complacent. Africans have come to believe that once you elect somebody, then your democratic duty, our civic responsibility has ended there. No, you need to hold these leaders accountable at the same time. You need to make sure that when you're having parliamentary or Senate elections, you change so that you can elect the type of group that actually think they share your vision. A lot of times our people vote once, and if someone doesn't deliver, sometimes they decide, I'll never vote again. And that's it. No, democracy is a process, it's a journey that you have to keep going back and knocking on the door every day. And so citizens of Uganda and of course of East Africa need to learn that this is something that has to be guarded jealously, and that on the voting day is the first day that you're doing it, and it has to continue for the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever, because the moment you stop caring, that is the moment they start celebrating. And that is how you find we've been electing people who've turned out to become lords. They're supposed to be servants. But how come we call them waheshimiwa when we are the bosses who elect them? It's because we've turned the tables and without them ever asking us to.
Yeah.
And because of that, we create such an imbalance in power that we feel so powerless to be able to bring about change.
Right.
And hoping that if Ugandans are listening, they need to know that they have power. If they want to change parliament, today is the day. If they want to change their president, today is the day. However, it's a tall order given everything that is going on to actually see sudden dramatic changes in Uganda.
Right.
The way Ugandans may want to see them.
Yes, Haji.
I think that there's the lingua franca of East Africa is Kiswahili. And there's a saying in Kiswahili that said, barabara unayopita wewe leo miguu zangu zinatona kama jasho. Whose meaning is that we in Kenya here, we've been through this. Mr. Kanenje, Dr. Kanenje and I remember you, I think you're too young to remember, when this 1992, the transition in Nigeria, all these issues, we were there. And there is an end game to Mr. Museveni. There's the natural end game where his life goes as everybody else's goes, or there is social upheaval, or he hands over power to someone and continues this system that we have here in Uganda. I think that the harder business, the hard business, is the business of democracy, because it's not a good system. It is just better than authoritarianism and monarchy. It's better than fascism, but it's not in itself. Democracy is a fumbling game. It causes a lot of problems. But we have to craft it, and that's what there's such a thing called statecraft. And part of statecraft is having a system in which the economy, the people, and the state have a social compact, have an agreement, a covenant among themselves. And that's what's called constitutional government.
Right.
Constitutional government and the rule of law are at the very heart of how we ought to do our business. And if we don't have that, then the business of business, how to create jobs, how to build infrastructure, sooner or later is put on hold, because we have to deal with the social and political issues that emerge from society. And the leadership that needs to do this is, I believe, in East Africa. It will come out, it will organize itself, and the business of organizing the opposition, credible opposition in Uganda, is the first step, because Bobby Wine is not going to beat Museveni in the popular vote. That's my belief. A lot of people might disagree with me. Second, he's not going to come into government and create 1 million jobs. He doesn't have the experience, and he doesn't have the English word fails me, but the French word is the je ne sais quoi. He doesn't have it. And Mr. Besige should not lose heart. The opposition in this country, in our country, paid such a huge price. But finally, we opened that big door. And sooner or later, we here in Kenya ourselves are trying to craft a non-tribal democracy.
Right.
Because what we have right now is this, I can't run for the president of this country because I come from a certain ethnic group. And that ethnic group is not allowed to get into the very top of power, because the major ethnic groups are going to decide among themselves who's going to get into power, and that struggle is in between.
But this is a historical system.
Yeah, so it is a terrible system, right, because it does not recognize talent. It doesn't recognize citizenship. It doesn't recognize individual leaders. A political party sees a leader, they have to embrace that leader and say, you look like a good leader, Mr. Kanenje, we need you to lead us. We will get there. Maybe our kids will get there. But our job, my generation's job, is to get us to, as MLK used to say, the promised land. And inshallah.
All right. Let's just listen in to Robert Chagulanyi, who spoke and made remarks right after voting at the Magere polling station near Kampala in Uganda. Let's hear what he said.
2 days ago, social media was switched off, but yesterday, the entire internet blacked out. This is one of the many efforts that General Museveni is doing to make sure that we vote in the dark, to make sure that Uganda is kept in the dark, that the world is kept in the dark about Uganda.
So you have it, very young, of course, very strong sentiments with regards to what is happening there. So some would say also as well, with him, not lacking what we say is the administrative capabilities probably of being the president of Uganda at this particular point, and maybe it opens up the doors of hope for a democratic transition that would probably take Ugandans from the current regime to something a little bit different.
Excuse me, Dr. Kanenje. Yes. I just want to add that little. You're absolutely right. Of course, we're critical of him, but he's bringing something to the table. He's mobilized the youth. That's huge. We've got to give him credit for that, because the youth are going to play a fundamental part in Ugandan politics and in East African politics. And I think that the opposition now needs to see, after a post-mortem, we have the population, we have the backing of half or maybe even more of the people. How do we get down the road and get all the other groups into the opposition so that we can put the fire of hell under the feet of Museveni, and that will give him the incentive to leave power peacefully. Dr. Kanenja brought up also a very important point, this point of making sure that Mr. Museveni goes safely without any repercussions. And I think that's part of the thing that Kenya has experienced. You can tell the types of politicians we have in Kenya by those who go and hobnob with Mr. Museveni in Uganda. You know, our politicians are hanging out with Mr. Museveni and campaigning for him. So I think that it is very, very critical. If there's a message that we can bring out here, if there's something that Dr. Kanenja and I will say today, it is a broad-based opposition with a credible leader that now goes into the real final stretch of getting the nitty-gritty together and the popular appeal for the opposition and to force Mr. Museveni out of power democratically. Because if the opposition has the majority of the people on his side and he refuses to leave, I think the international community will intervene, just the way they intervened here with Daniel Torikita.
Right.
So I think if any message we could give out, me and Dr. Kanenja, that should be the message for the people of Uganda.
Right, and that's a good message as we probably wind up. I'll give both of you as well a chance to just make your closing remarks. I'll start with you, Dr. Kanenje. So this is happening, of course, in a couple of hours. The voting would have, polling stations will be closed in what? It's 2, 3, 4. So in the next 2 hours, the voting polling stations will be closed. I think it's 1 hour. My director is informing me it's in exactly 1 hour, and the voting counting will begin, and we'll know who the president is. And I think a lot of people know who the president might be. Your closing remarks.
Yeah, Robert Chagulan, you just said that the government has decided to ensure that voting takes place in the dark. Well, in the dark, it's easy to commit crime. But in terms of social media and internet, that is also probably the most effective platform for the youth and the young people in terms of mobilization. What my message would be this: despite what the outcome is going to be, I would like Ugandans to stay peaceful.
Right.
There is nothing that is going to be worth the price of actually being peaceful. You see, say those who fights and runs away lives to fight another day.
Right.
But if you fight and you decide to stay there, chances are you're going to get killed. To move from the current nightmare of real and perceived oppression or lack of democratic space to the dream of a peaceful, stable, growing, democratic Uganda is going to be a journey. It's going to take a lot of stakeholders, everybody putting their hands on the deck. It's going to involve a lot of sacrifice from Ugandans, rich, old, young, poor, name it. And it is something that is going to take patience among Ugandans. And they have to be prepared to pay the price of patience. And sometimes you're going to pay for it in blood and treasure. However, whatever happens, as they say in my field where I come from, I'd rather sweat in peace than bleed in war. And if history of Uganda is anything to go by, I think they should pay attention to it and realize that Uganda is more important than everybody in there. President Museveni may win or lose, but he's just a human. His time will come. But whatever happens, I think Ugandans have a responsibility, a moral and civic responsibility to make sure that the country doesn't go to the dogs. It's too beautiful, a country destroyed.
But the drums of change are beating.
Yes, and that is something cannot be stopped. Uganda is on that trajectory. And change, we're going to see it one of these days in our life.
Change is painful. Giving birth to a new society or to a new political arrangement or to a new dispensation is painful. And we all want peace, and I agree with my colleague. But we also need to organize in peaceful ways, because the great philosopher Frederick Douglass said that power doesn't cede anything without a demand. And I think that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people is the answer to our troubles here in this region and in the continent. You can see what's going on in Ethiopia. The bright lights of Africa now in West Africa, where Ghana has just gone through an election, and the last village determined who's going to become the president. There are great success stories around Africa. We don't want to depress anyone, but the message to the people of Uganda is dignity, dignity, dignity. You fight for your rights, fight it in a civil way, and make sure that you go and vote. Whether or not that vote is going to be stolen or trashed, the right to vote is the most basic thing that people have. And I think that the government of Uganda ought to please show restraint as far as political violence is concerned. It's just not right to turn off the internet, to turn off all these things. It is not the modern way of doing things. It's despicable. I condemn it. This panel condemns it. We Kenyans condemn it. And we wish the Ugandan people a peaceful day and a peaceful future. And we hope that they get the government they deserve.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Ahmed Ashi, governance and policy expert, as well as Dr. Hassan Kanenje, the director of the Horn Institute for Strategic Studies. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in this afternoon. And we'll be still taking a look at what is happening in Uganda. Just exactly 1 hour to the close of the polling stations. We'll be heading to our normal broadcasting before we head back to our sister station back in Uganda, NTV Uganda. Remember, more than 18 million people who are registered to take part in the polls, and for a candidate to win, they must have more than 50% to avoid a runoff vote. The vote count will begin when the polls close in exactly 1 hour's time. That's 4 p.m. and results are expected within 48 hours. We'll be taking a very close look at what is happening there. Thank you so much for being part of this broadcast, and we'll continue engaging with you on all social media platforms at NTV Kenya, at Zainabi Smile. Thank you for watching. Stay with us.
This is NTV.
John Kamau has been through it all, from being evicted from his home to sleeping in the office and eventually becoming a tout. John now owns a fleet of buses.
In fact, wakati niliweza kupata ile gari ya kwanza, mimi mwenyewe nilipata kazi. Sababu nilienda nikaanza nikakuwa conductor. Wengine huona maconductor si wa muhimu, but gari hili haliwezi songa bila conductor.
Indeed, anakiuka, which means going beyond and breaking barriers.
Nini tunafanya hapa sasa? Sasa wanataka ujaze hii gari, kiuka na watu, jaza beba watu.
So gari ndio wapi?
Umoja inako.
So sasa tunaenda umoja inako. 30 bob tu. Kazi iendelee, tukiuke nayo. Umo inako 30 bob. Tukienda. So manzo why give up. Zidi kukiuka na tuzidi na hustle.
Tuzidi na hustle in association with Safaricom.
There was a moment in time when we stopped attending physical classes to stay safe, but that did not mean that learning had to stop. At ZTech University, we continue to deliver the highest quality of education through technology and integrated innovation in educating our future leaders. We now have the go-ahead to go back on the quest of knowledge, to go back and search for solutions that our world needs. As we reopen to this new normal, we are committed to excellence. We have adhered to the Ministry of Health COVID-19 guidelines, keeping our students and the learning environment safe. We're back. We're safe. We're learning. We admit both self and government-sponsored students for our degree, diploma, and certificate programs that are accredited by the Commission for University Education. ZTech University. Invent your future.
This condition has been described as a silent monster that torments women and girls. Now, despite endometriosis being as common as breast cancer, it is highly misdiagnosed and highly misunderstood.
I first had to lose my both fallopian tubes and my left ovary. Endometriosis went with all of them.
Endometriosis happens in the reproductive age. How do we then improve the diagnosis? We shed light on this condition that makes that monthly occurrence unbearable for many women and girls.
Japo njia bora zaidi ya kuhakikisha usafi wa mikono ni kutumia maji na sabuni, katika baadhi ya sehemu wameweka mchanganyiko huu maalum wa kutoa uchafu maarufu sanitizer, na tunahimizwa kila tunapotumia tuhakikishe kwamba sehemu zote za mkono zimeupata mchanganyiko huo kwa kufanya hivi kwa takriban sekunde 20 hivi, na tuhimizane wenyewe kwa wenyewe kufanya usafi, maana wapo mwenzako hatafanya usafi basi anakutia wewe hatari.
Kevin Onyona, who owns the popular Swahili Village restaurants in the US, is back on Daring Abroad after visiting his home village.
The village is fresh, man.
How is he faring amid COVID-19?
We have learned how to adapt.
His views on the transition in the US.
Trump has not been a good president for America.
On Kenya to the World, leather exports by Rift Africa Leather, and on My Magical Kenya.
Kisumu Impala Sanctuary acts as a homage to wildlife.
This Saturday, 7:30 p.m. only on NTV.
NTV, turning on your world. The following program has been rated PG. It may contain scenes unsuitable for children under the age of 10.